Good afternoon, and I hope that you've had a great week so far. This week, we are finally diving into theories, and we'll be covering 3 theories for this week. So I'd like to use some time with the slides to go over these theories and some general things that you should expect. Before I do that, I do want to talk about the annotated bibliography assignment that is coming up in the 3rd week of class to give you a sense of what to expect and how to best prepare for that assignment. So the annotated bibliography is due on Sunday, April 17th, so the week 3 of the course. And during that week, you don't have a regular activity to complete, although you do have a quiz as normal. If you need an extension on that assignment, let me know by next Monday, and I'm happy to provide that. Just let me know what an appropriate extension time might be for you. What I'm asking you to do for this assignment is to pick a theory from the course, for instance, one of the theories covered this week, and you'll focus on finding some additional sources that talk about and utilize this theory. You'll also notice if you look at the assignment page on Canvas for this course, that there is a full rubric that breaks down the ways that I'll be grading and assigning points for this. When it comes to looking at sources online, I highly recommend starting with the EOU library database, which does a great job of entering in search terms and finding results. For instance, you might search a theory followed by the word communication to find results, including journal articles or book chapters that connect well. For instance, you might choose uncertainty reduction theory communication and see if there are particular pieces that are interesting or that could add for this assignment. For this assignment, I'm asking you to cite from 3 outside journal articles or book chapters that relate to one of the theories that you've chosen and to develop annotations based off of those. JSTOR.org is a great resource that also has academic articles, and it also has a feature called the JSTOR Text Analyzer. If you go to jstor.org/analyze, or you just search on Google JSTOR Text Analyzer, you can basically paste in text, conduct a search, and it'll find articles that match the keywords that you've chosen. And of course, Google Scholar is a great resource to use too. So I recommend using that to find relevant articles that discuss the theory that you have selected. Additionally, for the annotations, you should include a full MLA, APA, or Chicago source. Keep your voice where you're analyzing or making sense of the source and the ways that it connects to your communication theory. So don't just summarize the article, explain its relevance to your theory. And I've provided an example of an annotation on Canvas on the front page that will show you what to expect, both in terms of the citation as well as how you work on the annotation itself. I'll also look at rough drafts or outlines if you send those to me in advance, and I'm happy to provide you with feedback. It doesn't need to be submitted as an essay, just with each of your sources followed by the annotation. And that, again, is due at the end of week 3. So with that being said, let's talk about the first of 3 theories, symbolic interaction theory, which suggests that we're motivated to create meaning through the use of symbols. With each of these theories, I like to use an example or application from the real world. It might be a TV show, movie, case study, historical example. To start things out in a kind of fun note, I wanted to use the example of the Disney Pixar film Inside Out. If you've ever seen it, this is a film in which the various characters, such as joy, fear, disgust, and anger, are actually representing humans' emotions. And so these are people that are inside someone's head that are filling in for emotions, which in this way are representing and using symbols to convey reality, in this case, human emotions. Symbolic interaction theory suggests we're motivated based on the meanings that we've created using symbols. And as I talked about last week, the theories come from traditions, subfields, and approaches. So this is semiotic and phenomenological, intra and interpersonal communication, meaning that it's with yourself or with another person, and both an interpretive and hermeneutic approach that attempts to understand and create meaning out of our experience. SI assumes that we use communication to make meaning, that communication is the process of building meaning and understanding among different people. That self-concept, the beliefs that we have about who we are as human beings, motivate the actions that we do, and that we as people have a unique relationship to the society, the culture, and the networks that we find ourselves a part of. Last week, I talked a little bit about this idea of symbols, such as the pi symbol being used to represent communication phenomena. In this way, right, SI, or symbolic interaction, is how we use symbols to communicate, whether they're words, whether they're images, and so on. That these symbols that we use, for instance, the letters DOG to spell dog, represent the idea of a four-legged caiman. And we use those symbols and use of language to connect with other people on a day-to-day basis. That idea of using symbols to share and convey who we are is at the core of symbolic interaction theory. Additionally, there's this idea of a significant symbol, one that might carry significant meaning. For instance, in the Vietnam War era, the peace symbol became an important representation of anti-war and peace in response to that violence. Symbolic interaction theory was developed by a Chicago philosopher by the name of George Herbert Mead, who was really concerned with how we as humans create meaning through the use of symbols. You'll notice through reading this chapter that there are two different schools of thought that help to develop the theory. The Chicago school that's more focused on qualitative and interpretive approaches, and the Iowa school that's more focused on quantitative, numbered, data-driven approaches. But both help to develop this theory over time. A core idea here in understanding and making sense of the symbolic interaction theory is the idea of a self-concept. It's a stable belief in who you are as a person. That is, no person was created on an island, right? That people over time in developing their who they are as human beings have done so through relationships. If you're an outgoing person, you know that you're outgoing because you've met people that are not, and you've contrasted yourself with others. Meaning then is how we interpret and make sense of the social experiences and relationships that we form with others. And then mind refers to how we use language to convey what it is that we're feeling. For instance, if you've ever felt like you've had an idea in your head or you've had a thought, but it didn't come out quite right when you shared it with somebody else, that's an example of the role that mind plays in the communication process. That mind is about taking what's in here and forming it into language to convey our reality to other people. If you've ever seen To Kill a Mockingbird or read the book, you're familiar with Atticus Finch, who is an attorney who's famous for saying that empathy is about putting yourself in somebody else's shoes and walking around in them for a while. We do this through role taking, taking on the perspective or experience of other people and imagining ourselves in their shoes. If we have a complicated story to tell about a rugby game and we have a grandparent who knows nothing about rugby, right, we might simplify or use alternative phrasing to take on the role or understand their perspective. The thought that we develop over time and the way that we share that through communication is based on our inner conversation about imagining or predicting our relationships with others. There's also the idea of the looking glass self. That is, how do we look or how do we imagine ourselves looking to other people? It's sort of like if you're playing a video game in a first-person view and you switch to a third person. How do you feel like you're presenting yourself as if you were somebody else? The Pygmalion effect is the idea we oftentimes live up or down to the expectations of others. If people are cheering us on in a big game, we feel more motivated to do well. If somebody is scolding us and telling us that we can't succeed, we're more likely to be pessimistic and not do so. Additionally, when it comes to generating and creating meaning, particular others, those that are close to us, are more important to developing our sense of self, and generalized others or society as a whole are less important, but they do assist in the process of developing and figuring out who we are and how we fit into society. Every theory in this course has some critique and pushback. Some critiques of symbolic interaction suggest that it's too focused on the individual and how the individual creates meaning through self-concept, right? But doesn't focus as much on society and how society creates this idea of a self more broadly. Symbolic interaction is also a very broad theory, right? It covers a lot of ground, and as a result, it can be a little bit vague. And lastly, there are concerns that symbolic interaction theory doesn't fully consider issues of human emotion or expression. It's a useful theory. It's been utilized throughout the study of communication for a very long time, but it's important to note some of the critiques that it's received. As mentioned, Inside Out was a film released in 2015 in which it follows a young teenage girl named Riley who has different emotions in her head who are represented through characters. In this way, this shows symbolic interaction theory in action. That is, the use of symbols to convey meaning and share reality very obviously is at play here. Joy is happy, envy is disgusted, sadness is droopy, right? The way that the characters portray themselves and are perceived literally represent and symbolize human emotions. One of the interesting things about this film is that it was actually developed later as a teaching tool in order to understand human emotions for folks that might have developmental disabilities. By having a visual model of emotions, it helped a lot of people to develop those skills. So let's shift gears and focus next on uncertainty reduction theory, or URT. Uncertainty reduction theory suggests that every day we encounter uncertainty. You might think about this as stranger danger or fear surrounding other people. And we use communication as a tool to reduce the ambiguity and uncertainty that we feel with other people. Uncertainty takes a lot out of us, so let's get rid of it. An example of this is the TV show Catfish. If you haven't seen it or heard of the concept of catfishing, it refers to the idea of portraying yourself as a totally different person online, right? Creating a sort of fraudulent persona or identity that doesn't actually represent who you are. And the way that you might use communication strategies to manage or to develop trust with somebody that you're not entirely sure is telling the truth. This comes from a social psychological perspective or tradition, examining human behavior, again, as intra and interpersonal communication, but as a more positivistic or empirical approach that focuses on the development of laws or axioms that attempt to predict how we address uncertainty. URT comes with a few key assumptions. One of them being that we as human beings experience uncertainty in our communication that creates stress. That when we feel uncertain or anxious about other people, we don't know if we can trust them, that can be distressing to us. When strangers meet, we reduce uncertainty. The more that we spend time with and understand somebody else, the more predictable their behavior becomes. Interpersonal communication between two people is a part of reducing uncertainty. The information that we have changes and grows over time. If there's a coworker, you spend time getting to know them, the more and more that you talk to and see them, the less uncertain you feel around them. And as a result, it's possible to predict how uncertainty reduction happens as you feel more comfortable and disclose and share more. URT matters because it explains why we communicate to reduce uncertainty. The reasons that we feel anxiety and fear in our lives, and how we can become more comfortable and open with other people. It comes from fellows here, Berger and Calabrese, who are both concerned with managing anxieties in communication, including the use of digital technology in that process. Some key concepts here in URT refer to the idea that we as people are kind of constantly researching. We're trying to learn and make sense of and learn from every interaction. We learn that our coworker always likes to talk about the weather whenever they come in. That would be an example of how we reduce uncertainty through predictability. We oftentimes like to predict or forecast possible communication options. What do we think they're going to say to us based on what we know? We explain and make sense of our interactions. What did I learn about somebody through talking to them? And uncertainty refers to the idea that communication could go a lot of ways. Somebody could be a stranger that we don't trust. They could be okay. The idea that there are different outcomes that could happen through our communication with other people is this idea of uncertainty. Uncertainty might be how we express ourselves verbally, right? What verbal communication somebody uses, their nonverbal warmth, how open they are with us, how much they choose to disclose or share, how much reciprocity there is. For instance, you might share a lot about yourself, but they don't share a lot in return. How similar they might be to you. Do you have much in common? And do you like the person? Do you feel like You would like to spend more time with them or get to know them better. URT is axiomatic. In other words, uncertainty reduction theory has different laws or axioms that assume how we respond to and engage in issues related to uncertainty. So let's talk about each of these in a little bit more detail. Axiom 1 refers to the idea that as verbal communication increases, uncertainty decreases. The more somebody talks, the more you understand and get to know them, the more predictable their communication becomes. Pretty straightforward. Secondarily, as we express ourselves more non-verbally, we're more open, we're more physically close to somebody, maybe we pat somebody on the shoulder or smile or exhibit more warmth with somebody, our uncertainty decreases. We also use more nonverbal communication when we're less uncertain. In other words, we become more animated, we become closer and more expressive as we start to trust people. Oftentimes, we're a lot more detached. We are less expressive with people that we don't know as well. When we don't know people and we have a lot of uncertainty, we engage in more information-seeking behavior. Is this somebody that we can trust? And we try to gain basic information like somebody's name, where they're from, and some of their basic interests in order to help establish trust. And if we know somebody well and we are pretty confident with who they are, we're not going to be as adamant about seeking out information to understand and get to know them. The fourth axiom refers to the idea that when we have a lot of uncertainty in a relationship, that we have less intimacy in the communication. That is, if we have lower intimacy, we have, or when we have lower uncertainty, we have higher intimacy. In other words, right, we become more intimate and we feel greater closeness to somebody when we're less uncertain about them, if they're safe, how they're going to communicate with us, and so on. Number 5 is the idea that when we have high uncertainty, we have a lot of reciprocity, and lower reciprocity with lower uncertainty. This is a tricky one. In other words, if we don't know other people very well, we have very reciprocal communication. It's very one-to-one. How are you doing? I'm okay. How are you? I'm okay. What are you up to? Not much. What about you? It's very staccato and back and forth. When we know people well, we're more willing to let one person vent or have a more one-sided conversation. That it's less reciprocal as we get to know and trust people better. The 6th axiom refers to the idea that similarities, having more in common with people, reduces uncertainty, while dissimilarities increase uncertainty, right? If you are a member of the same club or organization or group, you're less likely to feel uncertainty around that person because you already have a baseline of things in common. The 7th axiom refers to the idea that if you are less certain and know people not as well, that you tend to like them less. And that we like people more when we are less uncertain around them. For instance, even if you're not the biggest fan of some of your coworkers or people you spend time with, there's a good chance the more time you spend with them, the more you like them because you at least start to know who they are. Additionally, there are these ideas of antecedent or prior conditions that can impact how we feel around the person. Is somebody in a position of power that can reward or punish, impact our behavior? Maybe somebody behaves contrary to our expectations, and maybe we expect future interactions out of the person. All of those things can impact how we navigate the uncertainty in our relationships. Additionally, there are strategies that we can take to. A passive strategy is to be an unintrusive observer who's trying to learn and figure out information about somebody else. Active is trying to understand and make sense of another person, learning about them and their interests. Whereas interactive might involve directly communicating, getting to know somebody else rather than observing or learning about them secondhand to figure out who that person is and if you'll get along. URT has also generated some critique like other theories in the course. Reducing uncertainty is not necessarily the main goal of communication. Sometimes we talk to people that we're never going to get to know very well, like a chance encounter with a stranger, and that pushes back against the idea that we communicate to reduce uncertainty. Wanting knowledge rather than lacking knowledge can motivate more. That is, we don't necessarily choose to seek out information because we don't know, but because we want to know. Sometimes if they're strangers or people we don't know very well, we're not necessarily interested in seeking out information in the first place. And kind of like a game of Jenga, right? If one of the axioms is incorrect, the other can fall apart. That is, if we like people that we don't know as well or are more uncertain around, then that implicates how we might seek out information about that person too. So it's still a widely used theory, especially in interpersonal communication. The TV show Catfish, as I mentioned before, is a show in which people might be duped online, especially in dating. They start chatting, they think that they're meeting a young person that has a lot in common, turns out to be a totally different human being, maybe an entirely different gender, age, and so on. But it shows us how the physical encounter of meeting and getting to know somebody is a way to resolve uncertainty in communication. Lastly, let's talk about social exchange theory, or SET. I got into some trashy TV over COVID and started watching Bachelor and Bachelorette, which, if you're not familiar, are reality dating shows, right, in which there's one single person who gets to know and dates multiple people and decides who they might want to be engaged with. And it's an example of social exchange theory in action. People looking at their relationships, in this case, the leads of these TV shows, and choosing the relationships that they intend to pursue and view as the most worth it. This theory is socio-psychological, again, looking at our human relationships, interpersonal, and again, takes a positivistic and empirical approach. This comes from John Biebold and Harold Kelly, who are both social and communication related researchers looking at our human relationships and communication. Basically, SET is taking economics and taking a very quantitative approach and imagining it in our own communication. It looks at the worth of our relationships in terms of the rewards minus the costs. That is, costs are things with negative value. They're the things that are bad about a relationship. Maybe they're emotionally taxing, maybe they take a lot out of our time and so on. But rewards are the things that we enjoy. Maybe a good reward is the feeling that you feel more validated and supported around a person. You feel like you can vent. An outcome is whether or not people will continue the relationship. That is, we assess the costs and rewards and determine whether to continue a relationship, kind of like a marketplace. Do you choose to buy or sell a stock based on its value? Central assumptions of SET, and this is a big one, is the idea that we're self-interested, that we pursue relationships on the basis of what benefits us, that people think rationally about relationships, that they are able to assess the benefits and costs of a relationship, and that people will create relationships that benefit their self-interest. You might push back against these assumptions a bit, given that we might not think that self-interest is a guiding force in all instances when we think about family or other relationships. This theory also comes in this idea of interdependence, that a relationship between two people involves shared experiences and benefits, right? That people feel a connection to one another and mutual gain. You can evaluate the relationship and consider whether or not that relationship to you is worth it. And also some of the power and exchange patterns. What does the relationship and communication look like? Is there one person who's getting out more than the other? This idea here, right, of various approaches suggests that interdependence of this model is mutual, right? That we both depend on one another, that for the archway to hold together, all the rocks have to be in place. It concerns power or influence one has over another person, the potential for conflict or disagreement within the group, the ability to coordinate and work together on solving an issue, the opportunity for future interdependence or working together, and the certainty you have about the roles or responsibilities of the relationship. You might consider, if you've ever heard of the prisoner's dilemma, it's the idea that two people could choose to both confess to a crime, and if they do so, then they have the best outcome, right? However, if they choose to rat the other person out, then the person who is not accused gets off better. In other words, it is the most beneficial option for both people to confess to a crime. But if one person cheats the other person, then they have the potential to do better, right? And to get less of a sentence. But if neither of them confess, then they end up with a sentence that's worse than if both of them chose to confess. In that example of while it's the most strategic for both to confess, but potentially an issue of trust is an important consideration in relationships. That we might compare our relationships to other alternatives that exist and consider whether our relationship is worth keeping compared to another relationship we have, like on a show like The Bachelor, or nothing at all. Sometimes a toxic or negative relationship is worse than not having that relationship. In this way, we can control behavior. That is, we attempt to control the behavior of others, like fake control, or behavior control, where we alter our own communication to change the interaction. Maybe we don't like how our communication with somebody else is going. Maybe it feels disrespectful or one-sided, and we decide to change our behavior in that relationship. Additionally, there are some matrices available in terms of the outcomes of our relationships and how we might choose to share the rewards associated with those. And as mentioned, shows such as The Bachelor or The Bachelorette, which feature an array of contestants who are all vying for the affection of the same person, involve the use of this model, where it's using social exchange and imagining this type of transaction between people. I like this relationship and I like this relationship, but I have to send one of these two people home. Which do I think is the most beneficial? So, as you could probably imagine, this theory has some critique, and rather than showing it here, I'm going to ask you to explore some of the critiques of this theory for this week's activity. So to wrap things up for the week, as mentioned, you have your annotated bibliography due the third week of the term. These theories that we've talked about help us to understand our human relationships and the ways that we choose to disclose and get to know one another better. And as you're working through these chapters and thinking through these theories, you might think about what stands out to you about the assumptions or approach or application that these theories might have to our relationships. Next week in our video, we'll be focusing on social penetration theory, social information processing theory, and agenda setting theory. Again, looking at our interpersonal communication in more of an applied context. I know we covered a lot of ground for today, but thank you for watching. And best of luck with completing this week's quiz and activity. And I will talk to you again for next week's video.